The vulnerabilities won't wait for interagency coordination. The White House just signed an executive order on AI and cybersecurity, and the most revealing thing about it is not what it mandates, but what it does not. The order creates binding requirements for federal agencies to accelerate AI-enabled cyber defense while keeping every meaningful obligation for the private sector entirely voluntary. That split tells you everything about the administration's theory of the case on AI governance, and it raises a question practitioners should be thinking hard about. Can voluntary frameworks hold up against threats AI is creating on timelines measured in hours, not quarters? But there is another layer most of the coverage is missing. The EO directs Treasury, NSA, and CISA to stand up an AI cybersecurity clearinghouse to coordinate vulnerability scanning, discovery, and remediation at scale. And that directive lands in the same month that Commerce Department's Inspector General published an audit showing that the National Vulnerability Database, the coordination infrastructure the entire ecosystem already depends on, has severity scores that match independent evaluators just 12% of the time. Government is building a new vulnerability coordination mechanism while its existing one is collapsing. The context matters. Let me walk through the provisions that matter because the structure is important. The federal-facing provisions are concrete and carry real deadlines. Within 30 days, CISA must release binding operational directives to expedite cyber defense of civilian federal systems and establish or expand programs that deliver AI-enabled defensive tools. That includes facilitating access to cybersecurity tools, including frontier AI models for agencies, state, and local authorities, and critical infrastructure operators like rural hospitals, community banks, and local utilities. Within 30 days, Treasury, working with NSA and CISA, must stand up an AI cybersecurity clearinghouse in voluntary collaboration with industry and critical infrastructure operators. That clearinghouse is tasked with coordinating and deconflicting vulnerability scanning, discovery and validating vulnerabilities, and coordinating remediation and patch distributions. The Committee on National Security Systems and the Department of Defense must take immediate action on their own cyber defense postures. OMB has 30 days to identify federal grant programs with funding that could be directed toward AI vulnerability detection. And OPM has 60 days to expand cybersecurity workforce hiring through the Tech Force pipeline, which as of last May had onboarded a grand total of 10 employees. On the classified side, within 60 days, NSA must lead a benchmarking process to assess the advanced cyber capabilities of AI models and determine the threshold for designating covered frontier model. That designation triggers the voluntary framework for the private sector. For industry, the operative word throughout the order is, quote, voluntary, unquote. AI developers can choose to engage with the government to determine whether their models meet the frontier threshold. They can provide up to 30 days of early access before release to trusted partners. They can participate in the clearinghouse, but none of it is required, and the order includes explicit safeguard language stating that nothing shall be construed to authorize the creation of any mandatory licensing, pre-clearance, or permitting requirement for AI models. So this voluntary framing is consistent with the broader posture. As I wrote about in the Regulation Pendulum piece, this administration has made a deliberate bet that innovation leadership, not regulatory guardrails, is the primary mechanism for maintaining U.S. advantage in AI. The logic goes something like this. Mandatory compliance frameworks slow down the companies building the most capable models. Slowing them down means ceding ground to China and adversaries who face no equivalent regulatory friction. Therefore, keep the requirements on government, keep private sector engagement collaborative, and trust that market incentives plus national security awareness will drive responsible behavior from the labs. And there is a case to be made that this works, at least for the handful of companies building truly frontier systems. Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google DeepMind already invest heavily in safety research and red teaming. The 30-day early access provision is not asking them to do something fundamentally different from what they are already doing internally. It's asking them to share it with NSA and CISA before public release. But there is a structural problem with this framing. The frontier is not where you think it is. As I've written about, teams like ISLE demonstrated with their 3.6 billion parameter model that you do not need a frontier system to find vulnerabilities efficiently. Niels Provost showed this in his piece, Finding 0 Days with Any Model. That work set shows that capabilities live in the harness, not just in the weights. The folks at Mother of All Kevs, or MOAC, explain how they can autonomously develop exploits in minutes for nearly any CVE. When a voluntary framework is scoped to just covered frontier models and the classified benchmarks are set by NSA, it misses the reality that meaningful offensive cyber capability is already available below the frontier threshold through open source models, smaller models with effective harness engineering, and purpose-built tooling. The framework cannot compel a non-cooperating developer to show up for a review, and the entities most likely to cause harm are least likely to participate voluntarily. Now here is the context that makes the clearinghouse provision especially interesting, and in some ways concerning. On May 26, just 1 week before the EO dropped, The Commerce Department's Inspector General published an audit of NIST's management of the National Vulnerability Database. The findings are devastating. NVD's severity scores match independent evaluators just 12% of the time. Let that sink in. The severity scores that the entire vulnerability management ecosystem relies on for prioritization are wrong 88% of the time. Couple that with the reality that the unprocessed vulnerability backlog grew from roughly 13,000 entries in June 2024 to more than 27,000 by the end of 2025. CVE submissions increased 263% between 2020 and 2025, and submissions in the first 3 months of 2026 are nearly a third higher than the same period last year. The OIG projects yearly reported vulnerabilities will surpass 60,000 in 2026, a nearly tenfold increase from a decade ago. The Inspector General found at least 21,000 cases of duplicated work between May 2024 and December 2025, wasting approximately $200,000 in the process. Nearly 80% of vulnerability submissions already included a score from the submitting party, and CISA had been providing scores independently, meaning NVD was duplicating work that had already been done. In April 2026, NIST effectively admitted defeat. They switched to a risk-based prioritization model that prioritized enrichment of the most critical CVEs, those in CISA's CAV catalog, those affecting federal government software, and those for critical software. Everything else gets categorized as a not scheduled for immediate enrichment category. All backlog CVEs with a published date before March 2026 were moved into the quote-unquote not scheduled category entirely. So the government's primary vulnerability coordination infrastructure does not work. And now the same government is standing up a new AI cybersecurity clearinghouse to coordinate vulnerability scanning and remediation at scale. I do want to be fair here. The clearinghouse concept is not the MVD. It's a different mechanism with a different mandate. The MVD is an enrichment and cataloging database. The clearinghouse is envisioned as a coordination mechanism for active scanning, discovery, validation, and remediation. That said, the institutional dynamics are similar, and the track record is concerning. The clearinghouse requires Treasury, NSA, CISA, and the National Cyber Director coordinate with voluntary industry participation in 30 days. Anyone who's worked in the federal interagency processes will recognize immediately how aspirational that timeline is. These agencies operate under different authorities, different classification regimes, and different institutional cultures. Getting them to deconflict vulnerability scanning alone is a coordination challenge that typically takes months of negotiation, not weeks. The clearinghouse also faces the same fundamental scaling problem that broke the MVD. The volume of vulnerabilities being discovered is growing exponentially. AI is accelerating that growth. Mythos found thousands of high-severity vulnerabilities in its first month. Glasswing showed 10,000 plus high and critical findings across 50 partners, with a 90.6% true positive rate. Patrick Garrity's data showed CVE volume in Chrome up 563%, GitHub up 476%. So the clearinghouse is being asked to coordinate scanning, validation, and remediation at scale in an environment where the scale of any of the problem is growing faster than any human-driven process can absorb. If the MVD collapsed under 263% increase in submissions, what happens when AI-driven discovery adds another order of magnitude? This is the vuln-apocalypse I've been writing about. The discovery side of the equation is accelerating through AI. The remediation side is still operating at human speed. The DPIR showed a 43 median day remediation timeline of CAV vulnerabilities, up from 32. Only 26% of CAV vulnerabilities were fully remediated, down from 38%. And now the coordination infrastructure meant to bridge that gap is itself in a crisis. There's one more dimension of the voluntary framework worth flagging: the 30-day early access window for frontier models. I think 30 days is a little silly when you look at it through the lens of the actual remediation timelines. The DPIR showed 43 days as the median to remediate CAVs, and that is for known exploited vulnerabilities that are already in CISA's catalog. Broader vulnerabilities take far longer. If the government discovers during its 30-day review that a frontier model introduces new offensive capabilities, what exactly happens in that window? The vulnerabilities the model can find will not be patched in 30 days. But I also understand the other side as well. If the early access period is too long, it impedes the commercial ambitions of the frontier labs by delaying model releases. The original version of this order reportedly had a 90-day window that pulled specifically because of the competitiveness concerns relative to China. So you end up with a timeline that is too short to meaningfully remediate what might be discovered and too long in the eyes of those who worry about falling behind adversaries. That tension is inherent, and there may be not a clean answer to this. Let me give you the practitioner takeaway, because for the most security leaders in the private sectors, near-term operational impact to the EO is limited. Nothing compels industry participation unless you are a frontier lab, and even then it's voluntary. The meaningful signal is directional. The administration is betting on AI as a force multiplier for cyber defense and expects the private sector to make the same bet on its own terms. What you should be watching is 4 things. First, the CISA binding operational directives. These are the most concrete and enforceable provisions in the entire order. BODs are not suggestions. When they drop, they will define what AI-enabled cyber defense looks like for the federal enterprise, and those requirements will cascade to contractors and vendors. Second, whether the clearinghouse becomes a real coordination mechanism or another interagency structure that exists on paper while actual work happens bilaterally between individual agencies and labs, given the MVD precedent, skepticism is warranted. Third, the classified benchmarks for frontier model designation. Who gets classified as a covered frontier model, and what criteria NSA uses to make that determination will define the scope and relevance of the entire voluntary framework. If the threshold is set too high, the framework misses the models that matter. If it's set in a place that captures the jagged frontier, it becomes more useful. Fourth, the workforce pipeline. You cannot execute an AI-enabled cyber defense with 10 hires. The tech force expansion is a multi-year effort being directed on a 60-day timeline, and that gap between ambition and capacity is the story underneath the story of the entire order. So the EO gets the direction right. The cybersecurity provisions are responses to real threat dynamics. AI has industrialized vulnerability discovery and is compressing exploit timelines from months to hours. The attack surface is expanding through billions of lines of AI-generated code. Remediation capacity is flat at best and declining by some measures. But the vulnapocalypse is not waiting for interagency coordination to mature. It is not waiting for a clearinghouse to stand up. It is not waiting on voluntary frameworks to attract participants or for classified benchmarks to be calibrated. The capability curve is steepening with every model release, and the government's institutional capacity is still operating at a pace that reflects a pre-AI threat tempo. The order is an attempt to close that gap. Whether the institutions can execute at the speed the threat demands is the question that will determine whether EO matters or whether it becomes another aspirational document that reads better than it performed. Having spent most of my career in the public sector, I have concerns it will trend toward the latter, but I hope I'm wrong. My full article is linked below. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.